Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the second session of Sunoikisis Digital Classics Fall 2020, the Digital Classics semester. This session is going to be an introduction to markup, and the presenters are going to be Jonathan Blaney from the University of London, who's there on my right, I think, on your screen, and Charlotte Tupman from the University of Exeter, who is above me on your screen. We're also joined today by Irene and Monica, who are the co-conveners of this semester's program. If you're watching this live, you will have access to a live chat feature, which is either to the right or below the video on YouTube. Please do say hi if you are watching live, and feel free to ask questions during or after and join the discussion at the end. We will have a little bit of discussion time at the very end of this session. If you're not watching live, welcome anyway, but unfortunately you can't join the live discussion without access to a time machine anyway. There is a session page for this session on the Sunoikisis DC GitHub page. There's a link to that below the video. You may need to click on Show More to get it. So that will have some an outline of the session, some readings, links to some of the resources we're going to show you, and also a suggested exercise at the end of that page. So if you're interested in following that, or if you're following this as part of a class and that's obligatory, that's where you find that information. The running order of this session is going to be Jonathan's going to start us off with an introduction to the concepts of markup, and also a brief introduction to HTML, one particular kind of markup language. There will be a very brief interlude from me in there, easily ignored. Charlotte is going to talk to us about a couple very specific, or slightly more specific kinds of markup. She's going to talk to us briefly about a kind of markup called Markdown, and also a basic introduction to XML, which is one of the most generic and common generic markup languages. Irene will then give us some live demos at the end and introduce us to that exercise that I mentioned a minute ago. So I think I should hand over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Gabby, and hello, everybody. So this will be a kind of history come context of markup, and I'm going to do my presentation through my browser. So if I could switch over now to my slides. What I've done is written my slides as HTML, which is appropriate because in the second section, as Gabby said, I'm going to be marking up a little bit of text in HTML and showing how that renders in a browser. And one of the reasons I like doing slides in HTML, which I do for all my online talks, is that it's plain text. And that means that, as you covered last week, you can keep everything in Git under version control, and it means I can push a remote copy to my backup, and everything is nicely controlled. So I like it as a way of doing it, but it's slightly more prone to going wrong than something sequential like PowerPoint. So if I get in a muddle, then please bear with me. Here's an outline of what I'm going to be going through for the next 10 minutes or so. I want to cover the history of markup and how things like XML emerged, but without going into too much detail about how things like XML work, which Charlotte will cover later. So markup, the origin of markup as a concept comes from printing, in preparing a manuscript for how it will appear in print, perhaps done from the author's manuscript by a copy editor to tell the typesetter how to display the text, or perhaps by the typesetter themselves. I can't actually find the term markup as a noun or a verb before about the Second World War in English in the Oxford English Dictionary. But certainly as a concept, it goes back to the beginning of printing in the 15th century. And markup in this sense, and in our sense, our electronic sense, includes both structural markup, which would include things like new page here to create a section or chapter, and presentational editing, things like make this word italic. And both, of course, as you know, are still used in computer markup, which we'll be talking about today. This could also include what I call semantic markup, where the sense of what is being said is also marked up in some way. And as you know, the editors at early modern presses like the Aldine Press in Venice, which produced lots of the first print editions of Latin and Greek works, were themselves extremely erudite scholars, which shows us that they had to understand quite deeply what it was they were marking up and working on. So to illustrate that difference between structural, something like a paragraph, I'm going to later on mark up something which is a syllogism, and I've also prepared an exercise for you to try as well, slightly more extended number of syllogisms, which I'll do in HTML, and could be considered more semantic because we're trying to understand what's meant by this series of lines instead of just thinking of it as meaningless text. And you also will be very familiar with markup, adding markup yourselves with WYSIWYG editors. A WYSIWYG is what you see is what you get. And an editor like Microsoft Word is the classic WYSIWYG editor. Oops, wrong slide. So if you make something in Word italic, what's happening behind the scenes is that there is actually markup being added by Word. Word itself uses XML nowadays. It changed about 10, 15 years ago to using XML behind the scenes. There is markup there, you just don't easily have direct access to it. But if you really want to, you can unzip a Word file, which is actually a folder, and go deep into the XML and find the horrible way that Word uses XML to mark up things in a very complex and difficult to work with way. But you can if you really want to, but I don't advise it. It's quite unpleasant to work with. And this is essentially the same with any markup system. When you view a page in a browser, you don't see the markup, in this case, the HTML. So there's this separation between the markup document and the presentation version, sometimes called a rendering, which might be for print or might be for web. In the digital humanities, however, we often use marked up files on their own to do analytical work. This is always going to be XML, I think, or some kind of other structured format, not HTML, to do analytical work on the document and to investigate a collection of documents computationally using the markup to get down into what's in there. So when I said that a paragraph is structural editing, I think you might agree that any presentational intervention in a text has implications for what it means or for how it's interpreted. And I think, so here I've put a piece of text in Malaysian just to show that if you look at this, and I don't speak any Malaysian, and I'm guessing a number of you don't either, essentially we can do very little with it in terms of marking it up. The top three words there, assuming there are three words, are they a heading or are they a very short paragraph? We don't know. So another example of markup being interpretive is anyone who's played a musical instrument from a score has probably made marks or markup notes to themselves on the score about how they want to play the music. And I think this is definitely a kind of markup. And it's not a technical matter on its own, because the changes that you write on or you mark, like which fingers might you use for which notes, where on the neck of the instrument, how you might bow if you're using a bowed instrument, is all an interpretation of how the music should sound. If I come back to this, sorry, I got slightly out of order with my slides, as you can probably tell. If I had to mark up this Malaysian text and it was many thousands of words long, then I wouldn't do so manually, because I don't know any more about the structure than I can infer from patterns of characters, spaces, and line breaks. And those inferences can simply be given to a machine to act upon instead of me doing it manually. This is where I'd be using regular expressions, which are also known as regex. And these are incredibly useful ways of working with patterns of text. And if you're interested in regex, and I do recommend them as a way of working with text, there are lots of good tutorials online. So my conclusion from this is that purely structural markup lacks human agency, because the point of markup, as we do it in digital humanities, is to work on the meaning. I mean, why, if you think about it, should we even add markup to this Malaysian text if we don't understand it? why not just leave this as plain text? What is the markup in a paragraph, for example, adding to our use of it? Because the information is already there. We're inferring that from the line breaks. So now I want to go on to saying something quite speculative about the history of markup languages, like the ones that we're looking at today, to put them in context. I think the ultimate origin is in this kind of thing, which you'll all be familiar with from arithmetic. The convention here, of course, is that we do the multiplication first, and the result is 11. If we do want to change that and make the result 21, do the addition first, then we have to put brackets around the sum. And this convention developed in the 17th century. And of course, you can nest brackets within brackets to make more complex operations, where you go from the inside outwards. That's the convention. And this creates a kind of tree structure with the innermost brackets being twigs, which was passed on as a convention to one of the earliest programming languages, Lisp, which makes very good heavy use of brackets. And its structure was then influential on all the markup languages that came later, XML, HTML, and SGML. And I've got a screenshot here of, this is a Lisp language called Clojure, and this is from a free book, very nice free book you can look at online, Clojure for the Brave and True, where the evaluation of these brackets is explained. And to be clear, this isn't just arithmetic, it's one for any functions in the language are all evaluated in the order of the brackets. And I think you can see that this quickly becomes very complicated, and people start relying on tools to help them understand the structure of where they are in this complex nested structure, which is also true in XML in particular. You can't really do it by eye, you have to use a machine to help you, or an XML editor, which we'll look at later. And this concept of a tree is really important in markup languages. Today we're only talking about a couple of them, but there are lots that use this structure. But I think the great thing is if you understand one of them, it becomes much easier to understand the others, because they all share this same common ancestry with Lisp. So to finish this section, I want to just say that I think markup is a reasonably comprehensive thing to do to a document. If you're going to mark up a text for printing or for the web, you can't just mark up the occasional thing, you have to do everything. If you abandon the task for some reason, then it's obviously incomplete. You wouldn't mark up some paragraphs but leave others in an HTML document. And I think this is something that might be a difference with annotation, which can sometimes be quite sporadic. So in library books, you'll often see people have begun to annotate the first pages of a text very closely, and then they've dwindled and lost enthusiasm. Or sometimes people might be just interested in very particular things, parts of a text, and annotations cluster. So that's my speculation about annotation, but I'll hand over to Gabby to say a few more words about annotation as opposed to markup now. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, so when in talking about annotation, I start just a bit sort of story, if you like, that when we were working on planning this session, I said, should we talk about annotation as well? Jonathan was, saying what he was going to say about markup. And Jonathan said, what's the difference between annotation and markup? Isn't annotation just another word for markup in many ways, or just a kind of markup? And in a sense, he's right. It is almost all instances of annotation are a form of markup, and a lot of markup is annotation. So it is very, very. It's worth saying a little bit about the particular use of marking up a text or any other kind of digital or physical object for purposes of annotating it, for purposes of adding information to it or adding observations to it, which is one of the things that markup does, but not the only thing. I mean, markup can also be used for adding structure and so forth. So so to illustrate what we mean by annotation, again, I'll start with pre-digital format. This is a digital file, but it would look absolutely identical in a 19th century or earlier print book. We have these footnote marks on line 2 there, American with superscript 15 and British superscript 16. We know that those are footnote marks, and if we look either at the bottom of the page or at the end of the chapter or the end of the book, depending on the format used, we will find some information. annotating or glossing what we mean there, and that in this case we have footnotes saying what were the American and British studies in under discussion in this chapter. So this is a form of annotation. It's adding more information. You could have had that all that information just in the text, but they chose instead to have them as annotations sitting outside the text. And this is a case where the annotation is in the text but points to something outside. And another very common way of doing it, and this is something that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years, to annotations on classical texts, where the annotation or the commentary may sit outside the text. It may sit close to the text, as in this case, or it may be completely separate from the text, as in other cases, or as we do very often in classical commentaries. This is an apparatus criticus on a papyrological text, and the text itself doesn't contain these observations, but there's a separate document, or it may be a separate part of the same document, that says on line 1, this comment, on line 13, another comment. And this is sometimes what's called standoff annotation, so where you don't actually put the markup in the text itself, you put the annotation somewhere else, and you in some unambiguous way point into the text so that you can computationally make that connection in either direction. You can point from the text out to the annotation, or from the annotation you can find the piece of text that is being annotated for just for information, for ease of reading, or for processing in various ways. So when we talk about annotation in the broad sense, we could be talking about any of these sorts of things. We could talk about named entity identification, for example. We could say, I'm going to mark which strings of characters in this large piece of text are the names of people, are the names of places, are the names of events, are the names of buildings, or whatever. There's certain kinds of semantic markup, adding semantic information, as Jonathan alluded to, and I think Charlotte will probably mention as well. There are things like image alignment. I'm going to annotate this square on an image and link it to this line of text in the transcription to show which part corresponds to which. Likewise, aligning translations, annotating linguistic information, which we'll talk about in a few weeks in this semester. Commentary, as I just mentioned, people say in this line Homer must be referring to, and that's an annotation of that particular line. And the distinction between inline and standoff annotation, you can put the annotation in the text itself, in your digital copy of the text itself, or you can have it externally and pointing in. So just an example of how that works. Here's a piece of digital text. This is from I forget which text of Plato this is from. Apologies. I knew when I made this slide, but that was probably a couple of years ago. If I want to annotate this text and annotate the named entities in it, I want to explicitly say which of these words in this text are personal names and which are place names. So I can, and for this example, I'm just highlighting them in color. So these are all the place names highlighted in pink and the personal names highlighted in light blue. This obviously underlying it would not be done with color. The underlying processing would be this is analogous to the WYSIWYG concept that Jonathan explained, although it's not really WYSIWYG in the sense that pink doesn't mean names in any explicit way, but it's a slightly more user-friendly way of looking at it than the underlying markup. To use a completely different example, just to indicate that, here's a slightly different piece of text, and in XML, and being annotated again for place names and personal names with tags in the text. This is perfectly transparent for this short and fairly simple piece of text. Looking at it, you might frown and squint at the angle brackets a little bit, but once you've got your head around that, this is I think completely transparent. But it's nevertheless a little bit more user friendly to do it like this. This is not Plato at all. I was thinking of the other text. This is clearly Xenophon or something. I'm going to stop revealing my ignorance now and unshare my screen. That's I think all I wanted to say about annotation. Jonathan, do you think that that usefully dovetails. Is there anything left to add from in that discussion of annotation?
I think so. I think one thing that we said in our discussion earlier that you mentioned is that I think of annotation as a sort of subset of markup, in the sense that you can mark up anything which is annotated can be marked up, and it's common, when you take a manuscript that has annotations on it, to mark the whole thing up. I think that's the only. I suppose I'm making a banal point here, but everything can be marked up. So in that sense, annotation type can be. Am I making sense?
Yeah. I think it's. I think the distinction is more one of usage than anything, right? Because I mean, one of the examples I gave of annotation is semantic markup. So I mean, it's in a sense, all markup is annotation of a kind, and in a sense, all annotation is markup. But when we say markup, we tend to be talking specifically about, or we tend to maybe loosely we're talking about adding marks to the text to add information, and whether those are XML tags or brackets or pencil marks on a piece of paper, that's markup. When we talk about annotation, we're adding information to a text where we're talking about or commenting on the text, and those in practice those may be the same thing, but conceptually we're using them in slightly different ways. I think that's.
And I think in XML, when you start using things like text encoding initiative, then you start using different elements of XML to do that distinction.
Yeah. Cool. So are you carrying on now with your HTML?
Yeah, if you've said enough, Gabby, then I'll do a quick demo of HTML, because what we've said up to now has been quite abstract. So now I want to show something a bit more concrete. So if I could share my screen again. I've got a slightly complex window structure here. I'm going to start with, I hope you can see, this is a set of syllogisms, the main image here, of a text published in 1696 called Artis Logicae, published in England, although the whole thing's in Latin. And what I want to do is mark up just the first of these syllogisms here, the one on the top left, in HTML, because it's a nice, very small example, but it also does raise questions of how we do this. And as you'll see, it's a slightly more complex form of syllogism as well, with this stuff in the margins on the left of each term in the syllogism. So before I close or minimize the image, I'll just mention the long S, which you can see in the word est all the way through, which of course was used in printing until about 1800. I'm not going to mark that up. I'm not going to transcribe that specially. In my transcription, I have just done it as a small s, a short s. And I've transcribed, not that it took very long, all of these syllogisms in a row as plain text, and they're on the today's course notes on GitHub for the exercises. So if you do want to do your own and find different ways of doing it, then you're very welcome to. So that's why but today I only have this one, and it's important to say that this is the same file I'm viewing with a text editor on the left, and I'm using Chrome, the browser, on the right. And the file is called something like syllogism.html. And this is this split that I was talking about earlier between presentation and editing. The presentational form is the browser one. And I'm using Notepad on Windows because it's the most basic form of editor, not because I like it, just to show that you don't need anything fancy at all to edit HTML. And you can use the browser locally with your file to view your own file, just to get immediate feedback. And that's why I think it's a good way of starting to learn markup. The first thing you'll notice is that the browser doesn't know anything about the line break. So it's put everything onto one line there on the right-hand side. And so we need to add that in the markup to make it recognize that things should go on different lines. So the very first thing I'm going to put in around everything is an HTML tag, like that, and then one at the bottom to close it off. The problem with using Notepad is that it's actually not very pleasant to use, but hopefully I'll be okay. And if I refresh this page now on the right, you'll see that nothing changes at all, because we haven't really done anything apart from say this is HTML, which the browser knows because it's called something.html. But it's good practice to have the HTML tag wrapping absolutely everything. Now, the first thing at the top was, I might just quickly show you again the image, just so you remember what we're talking about. This I, or number 1, Roman numeral 1 with a dot, is obviously a heading. So let's put that into a heading tag. And in HTML, that's H1. So I'll do that. And now if we refresh and save, hopefully, you can see that it's got a big heading 1 there, and that's the effect. Immediately you get this feedback, and it's really helpful for learning how to do markup in general, not just HTML. But actually, that was quite a small number 1 in the book. It was just a kind of section heading. So I'm going to go down to, say, let's try H3 and see if that's a more appropriate size heading. If I refresh again, then that's a bit more like it. So then we have the question of how we mark up this syllogism, which has got 3 lines. I'm going to try first putting in paragraphs and see how that looks. Paragraph in HTML is P. And then I'll do 2 more. If you use different editors, plain text editors, they tend to have much more help than Notepad offers you, but this is the bare bones experience. So if I refresh this now, you will see that it's made it into 3 paragraphs, which might be okay, but it sort of separates out the syllogism in a way that doesn't really make sense if we understand it as a syllogism. Notice as well that I deliberately left off the closing P tag here. It doesn't matter because HTML is very forgiving. That's another reason I think it's a great one to start with rather than jumping straight into XML. If this was XML, it would just error and you would have to work out what the problem was, which not so bad when we've only got 6 lines of text, but when you've got thousands of lines can be very frustrating. It's something you get used to, but when you first start, I have found it certainly quite dispiriting when I first started editing XML to get these errors that you couldn't trace. But I'm going to try making this instead into a list, because I think a list in terms of the XML provision about what the tags are is probably a better bet than paragraphs. So I'm going to do an unordered list, which is UL in XML, and then these become list item, which is LI. You can do an ordered list in XML, but HTML, but what that does is introduce numbers. So these lines would be numbered, and I think that's very bad practice if you're transcribing text, because people looking at the rendering won't know whether the 1, 2, and 3 that would be created here are, let me just save and refresh, whether the 1, 2, and 3 come from the transcription, are they in the original text or not. We're starting to introduce new artifacts. So that now looks a bit more like a group, I think, of text. And then, of course, you remember that the word ergo, you may remember the word ergo was in italics, so let's do that. That's right. Refresh. Yeah, so that's that done. But then we come to the more complicated question of these syllables in the left-hand column. And what these were, I think, medieval classifications of syllogisms, different types of syllogisms. So Barbara was a kind of mnemonic for knowing the type of syllogism this is, which isn't all A is B, all C is B, or therefore all X is Y, and so on. So there, we could just do them exactly as they are and then put italics around the B and the R and leave the capital A as Roman. But I think that would be confusing. What I would probably do, and this is something you can definitely disagree with in comments or questions later, is make them bold. That needs to be a closing one. Let's try that. So that just shows it's slightly separate. Now that's obviously not a great solution either, because it's not bold in the original printing. It's kind of introducing something that's not there. But we're quickly running up against the limits of HTML here. There is actually an HTML list which allows you to have labels on items, but I didn't do that straight away because that's quite an obscure thing that's not used very much. But the main thing is here we can't do much more than try to represent how the thing looks, and we're immediately, even with this tiny bit of text, running up against limitations of HTML. So I think this is a good point probably for me to hand over now to Charlotte, who will talk about more complex systems, HTML and XML, among other things, which in XML you could call this a syllogism. Instead of UL, you could have an element called syllogism, and instead of LI, you could have an element called minor premise or conclusion if you wanted to. So I will hand over now back to Charlotte.
Thanks, Jonathan. Could we switch to the slides, please? Great, thank you. I'm going to give you a short introduction to Markdown, which is quite a simple markup language. It's a sort of lightweight markup language. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about SGML, which was the forerunner of both XML and HTML. And then we'll take a closer look at XML itself. Markdown has a slightly confusing name. It's actually a markup in that it's a markup language, as I say, which has a very simple approach. The idea is to allow you to create a document that reflects its structure, but with a very, very small number of characters. And you can see on the table on the right-hand side that underlines, asterisks, tildes, and so on are used to indicate things like italic and bold, and so on. And the idea is that it should be very readable. The document should be very readable to the human, as well as to the computer, and the markup should be quite unobtrusive. Markdown focuses very much on how a document is formatted, how it should look, rather than what it means. We'll come to languages that describe more about what the document means later. And you'll find that actually Markdown is used on a lot of sites that you probably know very well, including things like GitHub, Reddit, and OpenStreetMap, and so forth. Now, it's not a totally standardized language. It has what's known as an informal specification, and it's got lots of different flavors. Essentially, people have created different versions of Markdown, different flavors of Markdown, according to what they needed to do for their particular project. And so you get Python Markdown, you get GitHub flavored Markdown, and so on. And if you want to compare these and see more about how they work, you can use a tool like BabelMark to go and investigate that. And if I just switch briefly over to BabelMark, if I just try, let's say, strike through, which is on the slide, but it's a little hard to read, so I'll do it like this, and then we convert with Control-Enter. You can see that it's finding the different implementations, and it's found 22 implementations for which this is the output. In other words, this is a great example of the different flavors, because in this case it hasn't actually rendered the strike through correctly in these 22 implementations, because this is a very particular flavor. If we skip down here, we can see that it has. In these 12 implementations, it has created the del tag in this case, and it's put the strike through through the text. In this case, it hasn't rendered anything at all, and you can see that there are various other possibilities as well. So, when you come to think about editing Markdown, you can use a WYSIWYG editor, but Markdown editors tend to give you a preview. Unlike in WYSIWYG editors, you can't see the changes that happen as you type, but if you use a Markdown editor, you can see them in a preview. So there are a couple I've named here, Dillinger and StackEdit. And in fact, they're very good for starting out with Markdown, because they give you some example text already, which you can just then go in and edit. And again, here's an example. It will show you, for instance, the different title levels. So if we add another hash to that, you can see on the right-hand side that it's changing the level of the title. And in fact, we could test out the strike through, couldn't we, and see how that renders. Yeah, and here we go. It's rendered the strike through. So if you want to learn Markdown, that's actually a really good way of doing it. It's recognised by lots of different applications. It can be used with any operating system. So it's very widely supported, and you can also convert between Markdown and HTML, for instance, or the other way around very easily. Wikitext you might have met if you've edited any kind of Wikipedia articles or anything like that. It's essentially a markup language that's used to format pages specifically in wikis. And again, it's aiming for a very simplified way of representing the structure of the document. Like Markdown, there's no commonly accepted way of writing Wikitext language, so you'll find that it varies from wiki to wiki, depending on what software is used. And here are a couple of examples. You can see how Wikitext deals with headings, for instance, in Wikimedia. So you've got 2 equal signs for section headings and 3 equal signs for a subsection and so forth. And I've included the link at the bottom so that you can go and have a look at some more examples of Wikitext if you'd like to do that. Okay, so moving from very simplified markup languages, let's have a quick look at something that's a little bit more concerned with meaning. SGML, as I said, was the forerunner of XML and HTML, and it's a standard for formally it's a standard for defining markup languages. It was originally designed for technical documentation like manuals and so forth in industry. And the key thing about SGML is that it's interested in describing what's in the document rather than telling you how something should be processed in the output. So it's not a formatting language. It's sort of separate from that. With SGML, it's interested in what's going on within the text, how you want to describe it. So it's interested in meaning, and the decision about formatting is a separate stage. And again, it's designed to be computer and human readable, although it's certainly busier than the markup that we've just had a look at. But it's, I suppose, in a way, it's easier because it's sort of spelled out. So here's an example of SGML, and you'll notice one of the things that Jonathan picked out actually, which is SGML, like HTML, I guess, is quite forgiving. You don't have to close, you don't necessarily have to close elements. So you have here a line, just the opening tag of the line, and likewise with the stanza, you don't have the closing tag of the stanza either. Essentially, SGML is interested in describing properties and the interrelations that happen between different components, different parts of a document. So it's interested in where a particular component appears and the relationship it has to other parts of those documents. And one good way of thinking about that is in thinking about how a document can be structured within sections and headings and paragraphs and sentences and that kind of thing. And within those, you're likely to find content that you're interested in encoding, such as I've used here names and dates. And now SGML allows you to describe those as names and dates. So you can see here an example where inside a paragraph we've got a name and a date. And this allows us to process all the names and dates in a document as names and dates rather than as something that's in bold, something that's highlighted in orange or whatever it may be. Now, if we wanted to, we could process names and dates that appear in different parts of the documents in different ways. And I guess that's kind of the key difference between this and the more formatting, the formatting sort of side of markup. HTML uses something called a document type definition. It's usually known as a DTD, to say what kind of markup you can have in any particular place. So it functions a bit like a grammar does. It allows you to control and impose some kind of consistency on your documents. And there's basically it specifies for every single element, and we'll talk about elements in a minute, what can appear within it, if you like. And there's an example here. So you've got an element, and this is the element paragraph. The two dashes just mean that you need to have an opening tag and a closing tag. And you can see inside that it needs to contain name, and that the question mark means that it may contain date, but it obviously might not. Okay. So moving on to XML. XML is very much descended from HTML, and you'll be able to see that very clearly in the examples that we have a look at. It's a simplification of HTML, really. It's a bit more constrained, a bit more restricted. But like HTML, it very much focuses on semantics. It focuses on what something means rather than how it looks. Now, it doesn't require a DTD. We're going to talk about something called a schema in a moment. But you can write XML without reference to that document that describes the sort of legality of it, of each element. It can be a well-formed XML document without having to declare those elements. And we'll look at an example of that. Here's an example of a very, very basic element, which consists of an opening tag, a closing tag, and some content. And the whole of that is known as an element. And you can see that it's distinguished just with the / in the closing tag. And you can add attributes and values to an element, and that will give you the chance to break down the element a bit further and say something else about what's going on there. And you can see here that we've put a computer readable version of the date into the attribute when, which will help us to process dates more easily, because obviously they could be written in any number of ways in the actual text itself. You can have empty elements, so they're elements that don't contain any content, and although that might be counterintuitive to start with, in fact, they just mark the point at which something happens. So in this case, this is the point at which a page begins. And just to say that you could have an XML document that was just markup. It might not be necessarily very relevant to the kinds of materials we deal with, but there are some occasions on which you might create an XML document that's just markup, and that's completely fine. It's worth noting a bit about how XML is structured, because it's a little bit more restricted, as I say, than HTML. So XML requires you to have an element that wraps all the other ones. And I'm imagining this here as a book with different chapters and different sort of sections, and within those sections there are subsections and so on. So any element that you have in XML always has to be contained by one that comes above it. And I hope that diagram is making it that easier to understand. It has a few rules. Every element that opens has to close, unlike in HTML. A single element, as I say, has to contain all the rest of the document. You can't have overlapping elements, and that means that if an element opens, it must close within its parent element. So you have to have the opening and closing tag within the parent element. And then because certain characters that appear in your text, or might appear in your text, form part of XML syntax, things like the opening angle bracket, for instance, you have to get round that so that the computer doesn't think that you've just typed the beginning of an element. And you can do that by, it's called escaping it. And you can see that, for instance, the opening angle bracket becomes ampersand and then LT for less than, the mathematical symbol for less than, and then you have your semicolon. And you can see that the same kind of thing happens for a closing angle bracket. You have ampersand greater than, and then because ampersand itself forms part of XML syntax, you need to have the ampersand, then amp, and a semicolon to finish that. That's basically it. There aren't very many rules. You might want to have a quick look and see if you can find out what's wrong with this. If you think about how to create a document that follows the rules of XML, some of you might spot this. It's got an ampersand in it, and the way we resolve that is by escaping it. By the way, just as Gabby mentioned, the colours are not significant. They're just there to help make it clearer to us as readers that part of this is markup and part of this is not. And you'll find that with XML editors as well. They sort of try to help you out in that respect. So that's one kind of error you might want to watch out for in XML. Here's another one. I don't know if you can see what's going on here. Well, here there's a problem with overlapping elements. So in the first case, I think you can see that role name opens within the title element, and then it overlaps with purse name, because you have role name opening and then purse name opening, and then role name closing and then purse name closing. And of course, you can't overlap your elements, and so at the bottom here you can see that role name should be nested inside purse name in this case. Here's a very, very simple, well-formed XML document. It follows all the rules. So it starts off with one element that wraps everything else, and then it has another element statement within it, and then it has a couple of elements, event and location, which sit as sort of sibling elements, and event has an attribute and a value. And your XML editor should help you try to work out what's wrong. If you do type out a simple document and you find it's unhappy, it should try to help you. But yeah, it's worth saying that XML documents can be very simple as long as they're well formed and follow the rules. Now there's a slightly different thing to talk about as well, which is it's a bit different from being well formed. If XML validates, it means that you've introduced something called a schema, which a little bit like a DTD acts as a way of defining what can happen at any part in the document. And so schema defines your elements and attributes and values. It says what can appear in any particular context and what must appear in any particular context. And the schema also helps out your XML editor, because the XML editor can check against that schema while you're typing, and it can work out whether you've got something wrong. So it checks for well-formedness, but it also checks for validation to the schema if you include a schema. And the schema can give you a menu of those elements and attributes and values that are allowed at any one point in the document. So if your cursor is placed in a particular point, it gives you the contextual menu, which is an aid to marking up the document more quickly. It means you don't have to type everything out, which is always worth mentioning. So yeah, just to say that validation isn't the same thing as well-formedness. You have to have a well-formed document in order for your XML to meet the rules of XML, but you don't have to validate it to a schema unless you actually want to. Most projects do use a schema because it helps to enforce consistency across a project. It means that you're trying to do the same thing. You should be doing the same thing if you're following the schema. Irene is going to be talking about XML editors in a moment, so I'll just say very briefly that it's an application that's designed to work with XML files. It understands the rules of XML, and it should make it easier for you to write it. You could write XML in anything you like, a plain text editor if you really wanted to, but it would be much harder to do that. And there are various editors available, which I'm sure she's going to talk about. But as I say, it checks both for well-formedness and also validity. I think that's all I was going to say. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. Was there anything anyone wanted to say or add before we hand over to Irene? No?
Okay, thank you, Gabby.
Take it away.
So now I'm going to do a quick hands-on demonstration of XML editors, and I start by sharing my screen. Okay, can you see it? So the first thing that to say is that, as Charlotte just said, there are several editors which are specifically designed for working with XML, so proper XML editors, as for example, Oxygen XML Editor, offering really many functionalities for advanced views of XML. Today, however, being most of these proprietary software requiring a license, I'm going to show you two editors that have not been designed specifically for XML, but they work really perfectly with it, and also with different types of markup languages and programming languages, as for example, HTML. The two editors I'm talking about are Sublime Text Editor and Atom. Sublime Text, on one hand, is a proprietary software too, but it offers, it offers a free version, which is really versatile, fast, and efficient. Atom, on the other hand, is an open source software and has some very interesting features, among which a good Git integration, and also the possibility of installing some packages that make really easier to work with XML files. In particular, there are some TI framework and its dependencies, which will be really useful for what we are going to do in session 3 of this course. So now I'm going to show you how to create a sample XML file from scratch using Sublime. So in Sublime, I can create a new file. Now I've opened it, and there is already an open new file called untitled, and I can save it by adding the XML extension. Okay. And then I copy-paste in it a plain text. In this case, I'm copying the beginning of Caesar's the Bello Gallico taken from Perseus Digital Library. So here's the text. And I'm copying it here. In XML, the entire text has to be inside a root element. So I can add a text element around the whole text with its opening tag at the beginning. I'll delete this. And the closing tag at the end. Then I may want also to tag the header by using a head element. Opening it and then closing it. Then you can see that my text is divided in 2 sections corresponding to chapters. So I may want to tag them as text divisions, and I can do that by wrapping each of them with a div, standing for division element. Oops. I'm closing it here, and then another div, and closing it there. Then I can also use attributes for declaring that they are chapters. So I can add a type attribute with chapter as its value. And I can copy paste it here. Then I may want also to say that we have chapter 1 and chapter 2, and I can add another attribute value for declaring its value, and I can use an attribute number for saying that I have chapter 1 and then chapter 2. Then we have also several paragraphs in each chapter, and I can mark them up with a P for paragraph element. And I'm doing it just for some of those. Here I can delete 1 because I've already said that this is chapter 1, and again I can delete 2 from here. And I may want to say that this is a paragraph, and then here that I have another paragraph. I'm not going to mark all of those. And here I may want to say again that I have paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. Oops. And again, I can delete the number. So I would like to show you one more thing here. As you may have noticed, in Sublime Text Editor, we have the so-called syntax highlighting, meaning that you have different colors for elements, attributes, attribute values, comments, and text content. So helping you to recognize at first glance what you have in the file and to better understand the file structure. So for example, we have the light blue for the elements, kind of green for the attributes, brown for values, attribute values, and black for the content. And this syntax highlighting is present also in Atom, where you have also another really useful feature, that is the automatic check for well-formedness. And as soon as you tell Atom that your file is an XML file by adding the XML extension to it, Atom will return you error messages every time it spots an error in the XML syntax. So just to show you what I mean, let's open with Atom this file that I've just created. Here you can see that we have the syntax highlighting too. And let's mess this file a bit, for example, by using backslash instead of the /. You can see that immediately I'm getting an error message underlying the very point where the error occurred. And for example, I can also remove the closing tag. And we have seen with Jonathan that HTML is forgiving, XML is not. So I'm getting a message where, an error message when it says that each head element must be terminated by the matching end tag head. So Atom will immediately know when something is wrong in your syntax, and it will tell you. Now, if there are no questions, I am going to show you.
There is one question. If you
okay.
If you want to reopen that file you had there, somebody asked, shouldn't there be a closing tag at the end of the chapters? Yes,
I'm opening it in Atom. Yes, all chapters are the element name is div, not chapter. Chapter is the value of the attribute. So the div is closed by the ending tag div, and also the second chapter is closed with a div.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I don't think so.
Okay, if not, I'm going to, if you're following this session as a part of a taught course, you will find an exercise in the in the page of this session. So suggested at the bottom of the session page. And for this exercise, you should create at least 3 files from the linked resources. Open Greek and Latin Perseus Digital Library, or Project Gutenberg, or British History Online, or Syllogisms from Artis Logicae. And you have to copy 3 text extracts, not the whole text taken from there, and paste each of them in a new XML file and add some tags. Some of the ones we have shown during the session, or some different elements. And then you have also to add those files to your Git repository that you have created for the last session exercise, and commit and push them to Git, so that you will be able to do some more practice also with Git, which is always useful. And you will be also asked to share with other members of your group and discuss the decisions that you have made. So to compare how have you marked up the text, and which elements have you chosen, and how they differ according to what is your different backgrounds.
Yeah, so I think what we should have said is also that you might want to start this exercise by, once you've picked your text, discuss with the group of people you're collaborating with what sorts of things you want to mark up in this text. Are you going to be annotating for entities in the text? Are you just going to mark up structure of the kind that Irene showed us? What are you going to try to do? And then when you try and do it, if you still have differences, why? Yeah, that's the interesting question. If you go away marking up something completely different, the differences are less interesting because they might, they might just be different texts. So we have a couple of
questions.
So one question pop up on the screen here. Does Atom have a package for TEI in particular?
Yes, it does. It was the one I mentioned before. It's the TI framework with several dependencies, and it recognizes all the TI tags, and you can download the package and so check not only for the well-formatedness of your XML file, but also validate it, so you can have error messages also if you are not following the TI conventions. And the other question is that, is the set of elements open-ended? Can one freely invent them, or is there a closed set? In XML, as the name says, XML is an extensible markup language, meaning that you can freely create whatever element, attribute, or attribute value you want. But it may not be very useful if you are working on a collaborative project or encoding program activities. So it's kind of useful to have a shared standard for allowing compatibility between different encoded text. And for example, we have the TI. We will be talking about this on next session. The TI is a standard of a fixed number of elements and attributes that can be used for encoding documents, and you can follow these. If you are following the TI conventions, you cannot invent you cannot create new kind of tags or elements or attributes. Values are often open, so you can usually insert whatever attribute value you want, but for example, the TI envisage the use of specific values for specific attributes, so it can be limited that too.
And for the purpose of this exercise that we've proposed, we actively encourage you to invent your own elements, decide what you want to encode, and invent an element to do that. But yes, for broader compatibility, you might not want to do that in bigger projects.
My syllogism example from earlier actually came from when I worked on early English books online, and we had to decide how to encode that using the TEI. So although I said you can invent an element called syllogism, in that case we couldn't, because TEI doesn't have that element, so we had to find something else within TEI to encode it.
Yeah. If anyone has any other questions, please please do write them in the live chat box. Or if anyone in the call has other questions or comments, please say them out loud.
Well, maybe if we don't have other technical questions, maybe I have a note about annotations and markup in general. So I don't know if we have enough time, just 2 minutes.
Yes, yes, please.
Because, so at the beginning, there was this discussion about annotations and markup, and given that our program is about classics or historical languages, we can add that marking up and annotating documents is an ancient activity, and this is quite obvious, but maybe for young students we can add this. So you mentioned and you showed very briefly at the beginning, Gabby, a manuscript. If you want, I have 2 pictures that usually I use them in my classes for markup, so I can share the screen. 1 second. Okay. Okay, I hope. Okay, so I hope you can see my slide. So in this case, of course, is an example where we have a folio, basically a page of a manuscript for the Homeric tradition. Okay, in this case, we can't read, but we can see how many different texts we have in this page. We can consider this a sort of collaborative environment, because in this case, we have different parts written by different hands and people. We have the main text with the Homeric text, the Iliad, but around we have many different things. And before, in this case, we can zoom the image, and on the right you can still see the entire page, and in the red rectangle we can see a sort of an ancient markup, because in this case we have around the main text in bold, if I can use this term, we have notes, commentaries, the so-called scholia. Okay, so in this case, of course, written in Greek with different kinds of comments, but we also have other elements in red, and you can see them on the left. These are critical signs, okay, to mark up something in the text. These are philological editorial signs, and this is a convention established by Alexandrian scholars to mean different things. And I also have, okay, in this case, just a selection of many critical signs we have attested in manuscripts for the Alexandrian scholarship. These red elements are meant to signal different things like the versus spurs, etc. Okay, the obelos, asteriscos, and other things. So these are signs used by ancient Alexandrian scholars. But I think that this is an interesting example where we can see a form of sort of markup, okay, with conventions. And on the other side, we also have scholia and commentaries in the form of an interlinear commentary. So this is something like a modern collaborative environment where, of course, we use a different technology, not parchment or a page, but we have different things. So convention, symbols, signs like angle brackets or other forms of markup for different markup languages, and then also commentaries and notes, scholia, written in this case, okay, in Greek, like in a modern environment where we have an interface where we don't see the markup, but we add, for example, an annotation. So this was just a very brief note, especially for students, so to understand that we are in a long run. So our activity today, we are using a different technology, but in the end, for historical documents, the goal is the same. And we always use, of course, conventions. For example, going back to the question about markup, we can invent our philological editorial signs every day, but it's better to adopt a convention, like for Alexandrian philology, where philologists tried to select, okay, a list of editorial signs that we can still understand today.
And when looking at that example, it occurs to me that if we were to try and reflect that in encoding, in markup in some way, we would have a choice, right? We could either say this text is in a smaller script and is in between the lines of the main text, so just describing it's physically and let people interpret that how they mean. Or we might say this text is by hand 2 and is a type of linguistic commentary, as opposed to hand 3, which is maybe, you know, historical commentary or something else. And it's specifically, we can point to which line it is commenting on, maybe even which words or characters it's commenting on. We can interpret those symbols rather than simply saying this is the symbol that is, you know, that looks like this on the page. You know, we can make a choice. How interpretive are we going to be, or are we purely going to be descriptive? And both of those would be done using XML. That's, you know, the one may be more semantic than the other, but it would be, as with the examples we're looking at for the exercise, whether the syllogisms or any of the other texts, you know, we have to decide: are we describing the layout or any other aspect of the physical appearance, or are we attempting to describe the semantics in some explicit way? The advantage of focusing on the layout is when we open it in a web browser, if we use HTML, the layout will be reflected on the screen. If we use something very semantic, even TEI, which is a very regular language for semantics, but even if we invent our own, the web browser won't know what to do with that, and no renderer will know what to do with that unless we write one ourselves based on the language we've written. You know, we need to write a language which says, for each syllogism, put it on a new line with a bit of a break above it. You know, for each argument within the syllogism, you know, do something else, make it a bulleted item in a list. You know, that sort of thing. Those rules would have to be separately written. So the more semantic we are, the more separated we are from the display.
I think this is fundamental, and in fact, when we start annotating or marking up, this is the difficult thing, and especially for humanists, because we tend to annotate everything, especially when you know the text, you know the history of the text. So this is important. Your research question, always focus on your research question, what you want to annotate or mark up. Otherwise, in the end, you get really a file full of annotations, but it's not this is not the goal of our activity in the end. So this is, I think, very, very important, and this is also important for choosing the right form of markup language also. So always focus on your goal, your research project, your research question for a proper annotating and marking up activity. This is at least my experience.
Yes, yes. Can I ask a slightly theoretical question for everybody? I mean, I was going to say particularly Jonathan and Charlotte, but all of us could attempt to answer. We've talked about how, you know, in a real project you might prefer to use the TEI, but for this exercise we're making up our own XML language as we go along. Are there cases in which it might be valuable or valid in a live research project to invent our own XML language specifically for the semantics of our project, rather than using an existing standard like TEI or similar? Can you think of reasons for that?
The only thing that occurs to me is that you might want to extend TEI. So I think you may find that for specific things, and I guess Epidoc is actually an example of this, there's not enough in TEI, but your base schema is still TEI. It's just you extend it with more stuff. I think rather than throwing it out the window, I think it makes sense to add stuff in when it's missing, personally.
Yeah, I've had exactly the same experience. So we didn't sort of start from scratch, but we rather took something that already existed and added anything to that that we thought was necessary. And of course, if you really do find something in your documents that isn't represented in TEI, which you think should be represented, you can actually make a case to have that added eventually, potentially.
Yeah, I also think that a standard for being really useful should be as widely shared as possible. So rather than creating another separate standard, I think it's almost always more useful to ask to the standard people to add new elements if they are not present, or using new attributes or attribute values or attribute combination for doing what you need instead of creating something different.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with all that. The case I was thinking of, maybe I didn't ask this clearly enough, was where, I mean, if you're encoding a text edition of any kind, clearly use the TEI. I mean, that makes sense. But there are other kinds of encoding you might want to do, which are not about encoding text editions, where it might be more important to have it in well-formed XML so you can process it, so you can render it into a database, so you can put it into a format that could be turned into linked open data, or that could be rendered as images, or easily turned into HTML or something similar, that may not have anything any relationship to divisions and paragraphs and headings and so forth, that might just be database-like structure or something more complex than that, that wouldn't fit into a spreadsheet. So people do in digital humanities projects sometimes use XML not as part of a schema, but just as a way of structuring data, in a sense. So Charlotte's example of here's a file with no text content at all. There's just XML elements that contain the data, and that's structured data. And if you want to structure your data in a way that's more flexible, or because you're at an early stage of structuring it, you don't yet know what the structure will look like, than a relational database would be, then you might just put it all in XML to start with, and then impose structure on it later, for example.
I would say I often use XML as a kind of intermediary form. So I'm not expecting to publish that anywhere, but it's it's from something into XML out into something else like a database. So then I wouldn't bother at all about TEI, because it's I'm not producing it for other people to share. It's simply a kind of byproduct, really. But that's a case I do a lot.
It can also be useful for while you're making your decisions about what sorts of things you want to annotate, while you're deciding what your structure is, what your agendas are, while you're learning about your text. So that's partly why we're doing this exercise this way. So don't try to learn an XML schema and then apply that. Forget about that. Just freely annotate whatever you think is useful and make up elements for it, because you're using this to analyze the text. If we ended up wanting to put this into TEI later, we could convert your syllogism element into a div type equals syllogism, or whatever. But for now, let's just do what's easy to read, what's easy for us to invent as we go along, and see what patterns come out in the encoding.
And that's actually a really good point. Well, a good point is, I think, because it draws out the fact that encoding actually helps you look really closely at your source materials, and you do absolutely notice things that you might perhaps have missed without having to think very, very clearly about how to encode those things.
Yeah. So I had a follow-up question, which was an even more challenging variant of the same question. Are there cases where you could imagine using Markdown to encode your project data, as in for real, not just as in this is a a documentation page I want to put on the web? Jonathan, you're nodding.
Yeah, but I think I sort of do that in my everyday life. I don't use Markdown. I use something called org mode, which is similar, and it's a slightly more powerful version of Markdown. And what I was thinking when you were saying that is that Charlotte mentioned Pandoc as a conversion tool, which is absolutely fantastic. I recommend everyone to use Pandoc. And once you have Pandoc and know how to use it as a command line tool, it's pretty easy to go from Markdown to something else, or from all kinds of formats. So it means you're less constrained. If you know that you can easily get this from one thing to another, as long as it's structured properly, then you're fine. So I think Pandoc is something I would just want to kind of give another thumbs up to.
Monica, do you know anything about the way the Homer Multitext use Markdown? Because I think they use that sometimes as an end product even of the encoding of texts.
Yes, they use it so mainly, of course, they use XML, especially for transcribing the text I was showing before. That image is an image of the manuscript of the Homeric tradition and is part of the collection of the Homer Multitext. So they have transcriptions of the text, mainly in XML. And sometimes, yes, I don't have examples here, I'm sorry, but sometimes, yes, they use also Markdown, but for simple documents, that's the thing, because then if you work with historical documents and then editions, because here we have two different levels, of course, the document and then the critical edition produced after XML, and the TI in this case is better. So yes, there are other cases where Markdown is also used, but for other kinds of things, for simpler cases, for data produced in the Homer Multitext, for linguistic annotations, maybe, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, because I tend to think of Markdown as a shorthand for writing HTML. If I want to put something in italics, if I want to create new paragraphs, if I want to make links, I use Markdown tags because they're much quicker than writing out the full HTML tags. But I know, and I've had conversations with, for example, Neil Smith, College of the Holy Cross, who's said, no, I don't use TI anymore. I use Markdown for everything. And I don't quite understand how that works, but
no, yes, I think what he meant is more for simpler documents, because I know they use XML. And then, of course, there is here a discussion and a big debate about the TI and other markup languages. But that's the thing, and this is, of course, my opinion, is important to know the difference among different markup languages, so that we don't have to adapt. For example, I don't agree with changing Markdown to meet the requirements of a critical edition. We have the TI, so we can use Markdown, other kind of text. I use Markdown for writing papers, for example, to focus on the text and not on the final layout, for example. This is, of course, my opinion. But I know that there are other projects, I'm not referring to the Homer Multitext in this case, where they try to use Markdown because it's apparently easier than XML, so you don't have so many markups. There are various projects. This is a question of, this is a decision, of course, and this is, I don't know. Yes, this is how you see. And for example, going back to producing your own XML, you can do that. I do. I have a project where I have both TI XML files and also just well-formed XML files, because I don't need the TI, and this is not against the TI. So I think, in my experience at least, this is important to know, to learn what and how different markup languages work. So, but for the Homer Multitext, I know they use, yes, Markdown, but as you said, for example, for HTML, for producing also web pages of the project, where they have different resources, not only the transcription of the manuscripts. For example, there is a web version of the Little Scott Jones. This is part of the site architecture, so this is something external of the Homer multi-text project where they use Markdown, because you can use simple syntax to represent also the dictionary. But that, again, this is a decision, because in the TI guidelines, you have the possibility to use specific tags for dictionaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to make the point that sometimes when presenting these things, we talk as if we're going from the simpler to the more complex, to the more sophisticated, to the more powerful, and that doesn't necessarily mean better. TI isn't necessarily better than Markdown, except in particular contexts. There are contexts for which TI is relevant, and there are contexts for which Markdown is relevant, and it's about making that decision. There are contexts for which Microsoft Word is the best tool to use, and that's some people may disagree, but that's.
No, I totally agree on that. This is the reason why focus on your research question. What is your goal, your project? You have to choose, and then you will choose your markup language. This is my experience, but I think we can agree on that in this session. But this is not easy, of course, to find your research question. It's a never-ending process, I think.
Yeah. Cool, thank you. So unless there's, I don't see any other questions in the sidebar. We've already gone 12 minutes over time. So unless anyone else has anything pressing that they want to add, we could let ourselves off the hook here. Okay, so thank you all very much, and thank you to the watchers, viewers, especially those who've asked us questions and contributed to the discussion. And please join us next week when we'll have the second of our 3 sessions on markup, which will be on Epidoc and on the Epidoc publication tool FS. And Irene and I will be joined by Alessio Sopracasa for that session. So see you all then. Bye.